9,000 years ago, long before the pyramids, Stonehenge, or written language existed, 10,000 people lived in a city on the Konya Plain, in what is now central Turkey. Not a village, but a city. A city, but it was a city very different from those you know today. It had no streets. It had no public spaces. There was no marketplace. There was no palace. There was no temple. There was no king. There was no priestly class. Archaeologists could detect no hierarchy. The houses were built right up against one another, forming a continuous mass of mud brick spread across 14 hectares. There were no doors. You entered your home through a hole in the roof. You descended a staircase to reach your kitchen. You would cook your food directly beneath the hole that served as your door. Beneath your floor, the deceased members of your family were buried. Not in a cemetery outside the city. They were buried beneath the floor of the very room where you ate, slept, and raised your children. This city, known as Çatalhöyük, was inhabited continuously for over 1,000 years. Generation after generation, the children of the same families lived in the same houses, rebuilding their homes on top of the previous generation's remains, eating and sleeping on top of their ancestors, and being born and dying in the same rooms as their grandparents. Then, around 6000 BC, it was abandoned. No one knows why. It wasn't a gradual process, nor was it due to conquest, plague, or famine. There is no evidence of any such disasters. The city was simply abandoned. 9,000 years ago, 10,000 people built something extraordinary in a plain in the heart of Turkey. They lived there for 1,000 years, and then they left. That is the entire history of Çatalhöyük. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. Let's get started. To understand Çatalhöyük, it is important to consider what the world was like 9,000 years ago. Agriculture had only just been invented. However, this was only in a few places in the Middle East and Anatolia. The concept of planting seeds, nurturing them, and harvesting the crops, rather than hunting wild animals, is no more than 2,000 years old. This concept is still revolutionary. Most people on Earth were still hunter-gatherers. The world's population was perhaps 5 million in total. The entire human race, across the entire planet, numbered fewer people than the current population of a medium-sized city. And yet, here in the Konya Plain in the heart of Turkey, someone decided to build something that had never existed before. Why did they choose this place? The plain is flat and fertile, and the rivers that irrigate it are predictable. The same features that attracted the Sumerians to the Tigris-Euphrates Valley 5,000 years ago also attracted Anatolia's first farmers to this plain. Fertile soil, reliable water. There was a surplus of food sufficient to feed those not engaged in farming. The first settlers arrived around 7,500 BC. They were farmers who grew wheat, barley, and lentils. They also reared sheep and cattle. They hunted aurochs, the wild ancestors of modern cattle and red deer, living in the nearby marshes. However, Çatalhöyük was not merely an agricultural settlement from the very beginning. It was a more organized and deliberate structure. The houses were built in a specific way. Each house was roughly the same size, approximately 25 square meters. There was a main room and a smaller storage room. There was a kitchen area just below the roof entrance. There was also a raised sleeping platform. The walls are extraordinary too. They're all like works of art. Painted. The interior walls of the houses in Çatalhöyük are plastered and adorned with detailed scenes. There are hunting scenes showing men chasing aurochs and deer. There are also red and black geometric patterns. There are also scenes showing vultures circling headless human corpses, which are more unsettling. Why are the corpses headless? No one can explain it clearly. However, something found during the excavations begins to suggest an answer. Skulls. Most of the graves found beneath the floors of Çatalhöyük's houses contain bodies, but no heads. Sometimes, skulls were removed after burial, covered in clay to recreate the face, painted with red ochre and fitted with seashells for eyes. And they were kept in the house, on display, among the living. According to the evidence, this is a form of ancestor worship so intimate that modern practices seem distant and cold in comparison. When your grandmother died, she didn't leave. She remained. Her face, sculpted from clay, was placed in the corner of the room where you ate, slept, and brought up your children. The dead were not separate from the living. They shared the same space. They were roommates. By 7000 BC, Çatalhöyük was at its peak. 10,000 people lived within an area of just 14 hectares. For the next 2,000 years, no other city on Earth had a population density to rival this. The houses were so tightly packed that the only way to move around the city was to walk across the rooftops, which served as streets, public spaces, and gathering places. Children grew up running across the roofs. The elderly descended through roof hatches. The dead lay beneath the floors. Meanwhile, the living ate, slept, argued, and made love just 2 meters above their ancestors. What was daily life like? The excavation findings are extraordinarily detailed. Çatalhöyük is one of the best preserved Neolithic settlements in the world. Its mud brick houses, buried beneath later constructions, have remained remarkably intact. Food remains, tools and bones, as well as painted walls, all tell a coherent story. People would wake before dawn. The first task was always to light the fire. The central hearth beneath the roof opening was the heart of the home. It cooked food, heated the space, and provided light. Keeping the fire alive was essential. Breakfast would consist of grains such as emmer wheat, einkorn wheat, and barley, which were ground in a stone mill, mixed with water, and cooked as flatbread or porridge. Lentils, dried peas. Occasionally, there would be meat, auroch, deer, or sheep, but this was a dish reserved for feast days, not an everyday meal. Judging by signs of bone wear and the tools found alongside female skeletons, women spent a significant amount of time grinding grain. The grinding stones found at Çatalhöyük show extreme wear. This was a task that took hours every day. The calories required to feed 10,000 people demanded hours of grinding each day. According to the same bone evidence, men show wear marks consistent with carrying heavy loads and throwing, hunting, construction, carrying clay for construction. However, what makes Çatalhöyük extraordinary is that the bone evidence reveals something else. The men and women at Çatalhöyük consumed roughly equal amounts of the same food. The graves also suggest equal access to prestigious items. There is no evidence within the homes that one household was significantly wealthier than another. For 1,000 years, this community sustained something that no subsequent civilization could maintain for long: true equality. Not perfect equality, not a utopia. There is evidence of violence, with healed fractures in skulls pointing to interpersonal conflict. Some households possessed slightly more obsidian and animal bone than others. Yet the gap between the richest and poorest in Çatalhöyük was smaller than in almost any society that followed. And the art continued. Each generation replastered and repainted the walls, hunting scenes, geometric patterns, strange vulture scenes. Real wild ox skulls and horns were mounted on the walls, plastered and painted, protruding from the wall like spoils of war. What did these images mean? What did the vultures signify? What about the headless bodies? We have the drawings on the wall. Words are not in our hands. This silence, the silence of a civilization that left no writings, texts, or explanations about itself, defines Çatalhöyük. They built everything. They left us pictures. And then they were gone. For 1,000 years, Çatalhöyük was governed by an extraordinary system. There was no king. There were no priests. There was no hierarchy. Every house was the same size. Everyone ate the same food. However, all subsequent civilizations such as Sumer, Egypt, Babylon, and Rome developed a hierarchy within a few generations. A king emerged. A priestly class formed. The gap between rich and poor widened. Çatalhöyük, however, preserved equality for 1,000 years. How? Why were none of the subsequent civilizations able to achieve the same? Around 6,500 BC, things began to change at Çatalhöyük. At first, the signs were unclear. The houses on the eastern mound, where the settlement had begun, were abandoned. Not all at once, one by one. Families moved to the western mound, a newer part of the settlement, located a short distance from the original town. The population begins to decline, which had reached a peak of 10,000, gradually decreased over the centuries. The population density that had defined Çatalhöyük for 1,000 years begins to decline. The images change. Hunting scenes become less detailed. The plaster renewals, which were carried out dozens of times over the lifespan of a single house, become less frequent. Obsidian trade continued, but the variety of goods from distant sources decreased. Something is changing. Why? The honest answer is that we don't know. Not exactly. However, archaeology offers us a few possibilities, and the truth is probably a combination of them all. Climate change. Around 6,200 BC, there is evidence of a significant cold and dry period in the Middle East and Anatolia, an event that climatologists refer to as the 8.2 kiloyear event. Temperatures fell, rainfall decreased. The fertile, wet Konya Plain became drier. The marshes that supported the wild oxen and deer relied upon by the Çatalhöyük hunters began to shrink. Soil depletion occurred. 1,000 years of intensive farming on the same land, without the later developed agricultural knowledge, may have depleted the soil. Yields that once fed 10,000 people may have begun to decline. Social pressure increased. 10,000 people living in attics, with vermin entering their homes through holes and sleeping on top of their dead, represents an extraordinary density of human contact. Over the course of 1,000 years, the community found ways to manage conflicts, maintain equality, and accept new members. Yet evidence of violence, such as healed skull fractures, suggests that conflict was ever present. Perhaps, over time, the mechanisms that maintained equality began to fail. Perhaps some families accumulated more wealth than others. Perhaps the community began to fracture. Or perhaps people simply left because they could. By 6,500 BC, the world had changed. There were other settlements. Agriculture had spread. The Konya Plain was no longer the only place capable of sustaining a large community. Families who had lived in the same house for generations, sleeping on their ancestors' bones and eating from the same hearth, may have looked upon the drier plain and the less bountiful harvest and decided to leave, as well as the growing conflicts. Not because of a catastrophe, not because of a single dramatic moment. Simply, little by little, family by family, generation by generation. By around 6,000 BC, the last family had climbed down through the final roof hatch, pulled the ladder up behind them, and left the city that their ancestors had founded 9,000 years earlier. And the wind began to cover the city. For 8,000 years, no one knew of its existence. People abandoned Çatalhöyük 9,000 years ago. For 8,000 years, its existence was unknown. Neither the Romans nor the Greeks knew of it. The Byzantines did not establish their empire 40 kilometers away, nor did the Ottomans or the Seljuks. For 1,200 years, the world's greatest civilization, a metropolis of 10,000 people, remained hidden from view. It was not until 1958 that British archaeologist James Mellart conducted excavations after spotting a mound in the Konya Plain. That is the real question. If Çatalhöyük remained undiscovered for 8,000 years, what else might be out there waiting to be found? How many more cities and civilizations, and how many more answers to questions we haven't even thought to ask, are still buried beneath the earth, waiting for someone to spot a mound in a plain. What does it mean that the world's first city, which showed that people could live in large groups without kings or other rulers, remained forgotten for 8,000 years? Did we forget so that we wouldn't have to consider what is possible? We discovered them by chance in 1958. We're still excavating. We're still finding answers. If you're intrigued by this story, leave a comment below. What do you think happened? Why did they leave? How did they manage to maintain equality, something no civilization since has achieved for 1,000 years? Subscribe to hear more in-depth stories about history, from the world's first cities to the civilizations that shaped everything you know. See you in the next video.